Welcome, intrepid historians. This week, we're going to be focusing on the Second Great Awakening. This is the most important thing that ever happened in American history that you never heard of. It is as important as some of the big three that we were talking about on Monday. So I've got an abbreviation there for Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening starts as early as the 1790s, but it's very slow to develop. So it's simmering in the 90s and in the 1800s and teens and 20s, but it really flourishes. That's what the F stands for there. Really flourishes in the 1830s and 40s. That's when it really goes big and nationwide. Probably every American in those couple decades was within walking distance of one of these revivals at some point, right? So the illustration is showing a Second Great Awakening revival, person overcome with religious fervor, some preachers up on stage, huge crowd, people in tents, big evangelical revivals. Now, you might be thinking, dude, seriously? How is this Second Great Awakening, this series of religious revivals that I've never heard of, supposed to be one of the most important events in American history? Well, a couple things. One, before the Second Great Awakening, the U.S. didn't really think of itself as a Christian country, but the Second Great Awakening begins to change that. It begins to move the United States toward a country with a Christian national identity, where Americans are seeing being Christian as sort of central to their identity as people. That really wasn't the case before, right? The American Revolution was led by a bunch of Enlightenment deist guys. Some of them were Christian, but they were kind of unconventional Christians, and so there was a sort of secular secular patriotism, a sort of separation of church and state patriotism in the time of the American Revolution. And the Second Great Awakening, moves the United States toward what it is today, an unusually religious country compared to most of the rest of the world. Second Great Awakening also is a main cause of the Civil War, the biggest war ever fought in American history. You probably know that the Civil War ends slavery. That, too, has to do with the Second Great Awakening. We're going to see that the Second Great Awakening changes how evangelical Christians in the United States think about slavery. And their divergent thoughts about slavery are going to be resolved in the battlefield of the Civil War. Also, Second Great Awakening is a major reason why you are doing what you're doing right now. This is both true because the Second Great Awakening transforms public education in the United States, and because the Second Great Awakening leads, among other things, starts the women's rights movement in the United States. And before the Second Great Awakening, girls didn't really do high school, and after the Second Great Awakening, they began to have a chance to do high school and college and have a career. It took a long time to get there, but the ball starts rolling in the Second Great Awakening. And this is just an appetizer. This is just a hint of the huge impact of the Second Great Awakening. So let's get into it. As I mentioned before the Second Great Awakening, the 13 colonies in the United States were not really that religious. Religious refugees founded almost half of the colonies, but those sort of religious beginnings didn't last that long in most cases. The Catholics, for example, Catholic refugees from England founded Maryland, but they were very quickly outnumbered by Protestants in Maryland, and Maryland ceased to be a specifically Catholic colony. The Puritans kept it real for the longest in New England, in Connecticut, and Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. They created a Puritan theocracy and forced everybody who came to toe the line. But it started getting less strict in the late 1600s, really started falling apart in the 1700s, and by the early 1800s, New England did what the rest of the country had already done they disestablished the Puritan church and established religious freedom and separation of church and state. We saw that Puritan outcasts, who, they got kicked out of, Puritans who got kicked out of New England for believing in religious freedom wound up in Rhode Island under Roger Williams with freedom of religion, separation of church and state. This is a trend that catches on. Pennsylvania is established by Quakers along the same lines. And so it's important to recognize that although many colonies had religious beginnings, the religious fervor and intensity faded over time, and migrants to the United States, whether we're talking about colonial times or since independence, most folks who come to the United States have been coming for economic reasons, and they've been coming for economic reasons far more than they're coming for religious or political freedom. Right? They're coming for economic opportunity. They're coming for a chance to earn a better life for themselves and their kids. They're coming for a chance to own land. Now, once they get here, they really dig the religious freedom that's available, the political freedom that's available, the opportunity to vote. But the main lure is always financial, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's people have a right to seek a better life. But religious freedom also means a freedom to opt out of religion. And by the time of our country's birth, 1776, most Americans had opted out of going to church altogether. Church attendance hit its nadir, its all-time low, around the time of the American Revolution. Our country was born during the least religious period in its history. At that point, only about 1 out of 6 Americans bothered to go to church regularly. This is the U.S. before the Second Great Awakening. This is what happens as a result of the Second Great Awakening. We see a doubling of church attendance in the United States. Now, it's still the case that most Americans weren't bothering to go to church, but doubling the percentage from 1 out of 6 Americans going to church to 1 out of 3 Americans going to church, that was a big deal. And it doesn't really end. After the Second Great Awakening, the United States becomes increasingly religious until religious belief and practice, peak in the 1950s, the 1980s. This does not show the period after the year 2000, but we know that there's been some decline since the year 2000, but we're still well above 1800s levels of church attendance. Now, if it's called the Second Great Awakening, we should remember the first for a minute. We didn't spend that much time on the First Great Awakening because, frankly, the First Great Awakening isn't that important. This slide is reviewing the couple permanent impacts of the First Great Awakening. One is that it weakened established churches. Established churches, you will recall, are government-sponsored, tax-supported churches, which were normal in human history from ancient times through medieval times through early modern times. But in the 1700s, Americans increasingly are questioning the idea of having a government-sponsored religion. In the First Great Awakening, a lot of Americans are leaving the established churches to worship at churches that are not government-sponsored. And they're starting to ask themselves, why should I pay taxes to support the government's favorite church? Why can't I just use my money to support my own church? The other and of course, a couple decades later, American Revolution happens, and separation of church and state becomes a thing, so Americans get their way on that. The other big impact of the First Great Awakening is it convinces slave owners to start making sure their slaves are Christians. This had been hit or miss before, in part because originally the justification for enslaving Africans was they're not Christian, and owners feared that if they converted their slaves to Christianity, then it wouldn't be okay to keep them as slaves anymore. Well, the First Great Awakening said, yeah, go ahead and convert your slaves to Christianity. You can still keep them in slavery because racism. And so after the First Great Awakening, it is a mostly racial justification for slavery. Racism existed before the First Great Awakening. First Great Awakening doesn't invent racism. It's just, racism had developed to the point where it was sufficient on its own to justify enslaving black people. And the thing about the First Great Awakening is it wore off fast. It was a flash in the pan, a dead cat bounce. The goal of the First Great Awakening had been to make the U.S. a religious country, and it failed. After a brief surge in religious belief, there was a huge collapse, and we got to the nadir that we saw on the previous slide with just 1 out of 6 Americans going to church. Now, both the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening must have some similarities, or they wouldn't have the same name, and indeed, they do. In both cases, you have evangelical revivals. Evangelical Christians, pietists, born-again Christians, periodically have revivals to... You've got these dynamic traveling preachers who come to town and get everybody fired up. There are 2 goals of a revival. One is to save new souls, to get people who aren't evangelical Christians yet, and to get them to join the faith. Maybe these people were unchurched before, had no religion, or maybe they're going to a Christian church that is outside the evangelical tradition. In either case, evangelicals want to make sure they're born again because they think that's the real deal. So job 1 is to get, to proselytize, to evangelize. That's where the word evangelical comes from. Evangelize is to spread the faith. And so they want to save new souls. They also want to rekindle the faith in the people who are already evangelicals. Get them fired up too. So those are the big similarities between the First and Second Great Awakenings. This is a picture of the First Great Awakening, right? You've got a preacher on a stump, and he's preaching to a crowd of a couple hundred. Here's a Second Great Awakening, right? They've built him a big stage, because Second Great Awakening revivals, that's what this slide is about, is how the Second Great Awakening is different. And the first way that it's different is it's bigger, way bigger. You've got crowds of thousands, right? You notice how people are affected by the preaching. You've got people sort of falling off their benches there because they're so moved by the sermons. Because there's more people involved, it has a bigger impact, and it lasts. And thus the impacts last longer. Finally, the Second Great Awakening is a response to big, fast cultural changes in American society in the early 1800s. And so so we really need to attend to what these big changes are. Religion is complicated, right? Religion does a lot of different things for people, but perhaps the most consistent feature of religion is religion helps people cope with reality, including unpleasant or unwelcome realities. And the Second Great Awakening, for many Americans, was an effective coping strategy for the big things that were changing in their society, in their lives. And the Second Great Awakening isn't helping them cope by, in any kind of weak sauce way. It's not like, just think about Jesus and all these unpleasant changes that you're seeing will feel better. No, the message of the Second Great Awakening is to draw on your religious inspiration, to draw on the power of the Holy Spirit, to act, to fix things, to find what's wrong in American society and change it for the better. So, more on this in a minute.